South Korea reports nearly 69,000 new cases of COVID-19 just by 9 p.m. Wednesday. With this, the country's total cases surpassed the 19 million mark. South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin returns home from his 3-day trip to Tokyo. From restoring security agreements to ending Japan's export curbs, Park says there's been progress in improving relations with Japan. An evening at the Blue House. South Korea's former presidential office has been open to public since President Yoon took office and is now open for nighttime tours. Some 1,200 raffle winners have the chance to see it over the next 12 days.
Good morning and welcome to New Day at Arirang. The tally for daily COVID-19 infections continues to see high figures amid the resurgence of cases in South Korea. The accumulated number of COVID-19 cases has now surpassed the 19 million mark, with 68,721 new cases being added as of 9 p.m. on Wednesday.
This number is double compared to the number reported at the same time last week, a trend that has been observed for a couple of weeks now. Also, this comes amid the spread of the highly contagious new BA.5 Omicron subvariant, which is expected to become dominant in the country. In order to tackle further spread, the government announced that they will reopen temporary testing centers and secure around 4,000 more hospital beds to treat COVID-19 patients. In-person visits to nursing homes and long-term care hospitals for the elderly have also been suspended nationwide.
Attending an emergency meeting on the economy, President Yoon focused on the housing shortage and high property prices in the nation. He vowed to strengthen the safety net for South Koreans and eradicate rent or lease frauds. Yoon has more.
Affordable housing for all is what President Yoon stressed for the second time this week on Wednesday during an emergency economy meeting at a public rental housing complex south of Seoul.
주거 안정과 주거 복지는 민생 안정의 핵심입니다. 정부는 끊어진 주거의 기회 사다리를 복원하고 촘촘하고 든든한 주거 안전망을 구축하겠습니다.
He laid out government measures such as freezing interest rates on mortgages and housing rent loans, expanding the limit on lease loans to newlyweds, and temporarily easing the cap on loans for low-income tenants with expiring contracts. Not only that, the prosecutor general turned president showed his determination to root out what's been dubbed 전세 frauds.
무엇보다 전세 사기와 같이 민생을 위협하는 범죄는 강력한 수사를 통해 일벌백계 하겠습니다.
In South Korea, a 전세 tenant gives the landlord a lump sum deposit to lease the house free of monthly rent. The owner invests the deposit and returns it to the tenant when the lease expires. However, with this unique system, there have been criminal cases where tenants could not retrieve their 전세 lump sum deposits from homeowners. At the same time, the government aims to provide more homes. Some 25,000 new public homes will be available for rent within the second half of this year, while the ultimate goal is to provide at least 1 million affordable public homes within Yoon's term in office. And the government encourages private companies for more provision in urban areas for which there will be tax incentives and easing of some regulations. On top of that, the president has hinted at overhauling the laws related to the nation's current rent rolls. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
With Parliament reopening 52 days since its last plenary session, rival lawmakers agreed to set up a provisional legislative committee that will allow non-contentious bills related to people's daily lives to be passed as soon as possible. Lee Kyung-eun explains further.
In South Korea, each National Assembly term runs for 4 years. The 21st reaches halfway point in May. The much-delayed second term finally kicked off on Wednesday, while Senate committees remain vacant due to disputes over leadership positions. So the first thing lawmakers did was pass a resolution to set up a special committee which will pick up the slack.
The special committee will be reviewing and passing bills related to lowering fuel tax, standardizing industrial unit costs, real estate taxes, business meal tax deductions, and refunding public transportation fees.
The 13-member committee will consist of 6 members each from the ruling People Power Party and the Democratic Party, and 1 independent or minor party lawmaker. Using its legislative rights, the committee can put bills to a final vote on the condition of bipartisan consensus. The committee will last until the end of October. Also marking the start to the second half of the 21st National Assembly, the full leader of the majority Democratic Party delivered a speech. Following 2 election defeats, the Progressive Party vowed to revamp itself to win back the general public, saying its top priority is people's livelihoods. In fact, that phrase was mentioned 17 times throughout the speech, putting pressure on President Yoon and his PPP.
I call for your efforts with people's livelihoods. Our party promises full cooperation on anything that's related to improving people's livelihoods.
The DP also saw it as a chance to take a swipe at President Yoon, mainly over what were seen as controversial picks for the cabinet and his office. The PPP is poised to deliver its own speech on Thursday. Thursday is also promised deadline for the 2 parties to finalize the leadership positions for 18 standing committees. Once they do that, the parliament will be able to return to work at full scale. 이경은 아리랑 뉴스.
Seoul's top foreign and trade officials held talks with like-minded nations on how to make supply chains more resilient. Co-hosted by the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, the virtual Supply Chain Ministerial Forum was joined by 17 key partners, including South Korea and Japan. At the meeting, Foreign Minister Park Jin stressed the government's efforts to make supply chains more resilient while introducing its early warning system aimed at managing supply chain risks. Trade Minister An Dok-gun, who also attended the event, reaffirmed South Korea's commitment to work on supply chain solutions through various partnerships. In a joint statement, participants agreed to work together to alleviate near-term supply chain disruptions and bottlenecks and to build resilient supply chains in the long term. The nation's foreign minister returned from his visit to Japan. Park Jin said that the 2 sides agreed to review and negotiate to resolve their diplomatic row, namely Tokyo's export curbs against Seoul. Kim Da-mi shares with us his remarks.
South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin, arriving back from high-level meetings in Japan on Wednesday, said Seoul and Tokyo are going to continue talks about restoring their sharing of military information and Japan lifting its restrictions on exports to Korea. Speaking at Seoul's Gimpo Airport, Minister Park said the 2 countries agreed to address the export restrictions, especially at a time when there are global supply chains issues. Those restrictions are what prompted Seoul to allow the General Security Military Information Agreement to lapse. He said he explained what Seoul is trying to do to resolve the forced labor compensation issue. In response to Park's request for meaningful action, he said Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida listened carefully and pledged to keep working with Korea to resolve the matter. Park also told reporters in Tokyo earlier Wednesday that he felt that the Japanese government is willing to respond positively to South Korea's efforts. And during an interview with Japan's NHK News the same day, Park also said that he let Japan know about Korean victims' request to speak directly with related Japanese firms on the issue. Also included in the talks were ways to activate the 2 countries' people-to-people exchanges, which they believe will be helpful in improving bilateral ties, as well as the general sentiment between Korean and Japanese people. As for the possibility of resuming visa-free entry in both countries, there was agreement on the need to do so, but no further details were released. Park also said the same day that he's planning to visit China next month following his recent trips to the U.S. and Japan. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Existing anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders on imports of cold-rolled steel flat products from countries including South Korea will remain in place. That follows a decision by the U.S. International Trade Commission on Wednesday. Other countries on the list are China, India, Japan, and the United Kingdom. The move comes as the Commission decided that revoking the existing duty orders introduced in 2016 would lead to recurring dumping. The action is part of a 5-year review process required by the Uruguay Round Agreements Act. The act requires the Department of Commerce to revoke an anti-dumping or countervailing duty order after 5 years, unless the department and the ITC deem the order necessary. The U.S. Strategic Command held its first meeting to discuss North Korea's nuclear programs in late May. That's according to the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday. The previously unreported meeting in Omaha, Nebraska, was attended by dozens of U.S. intelligence officials, military officers, and security analysts. The group assessed the escalating nuclear threat from the regime due to the development of smaller so-called tactical nuclear weapons. The broader message from the meeting was that while U.S. policy remains focused on the denuclearization of North Korea, their priority is preventing the use of nuclear weapons by the North, something one attendee called deterrence challenge. Now, as you may have seen from our coverage yesterday, South Korea tested its first domestically developed supersonic fighter on Tuesday. In a chance to address the public following the first test flight, the pilots who flew the jet said it wasn't too difficult to control and that the KF-21 is a powerful machine. Bae Eun-ji files this report.
South Korea's newly developed 4.5 generation fighter, the KF-21, successfully completed its maiden test flight on Tuesday, making the country only the 8th in the world to have developed its own supersonic fighter jet. A prototype of the KF-21 took off from Sachon Airport at 3:40 p.m. that afternoon and flew for around 30 minutes at 400 kilometers per hour. Major An Jun-hyun, who was a flight instructor for the country's KT-1 trainer aircraft, made the historic first flight. Major An went through a year of different types of training to get ready. He admitted during an interview on the day after the test flight that he felt very nervous beforehand, but everything went smoothly after takeoff.
I'll never forget the exact moment when the wheels left the ground. I felt pressured, but at the same time I was deeply moved.
The purpose of the test flight was to check whether a newly developed fighter can take off and land safely.
The actual flight was very much similar to the simulator, and because it has 2 engines, acceleration was very powerful. It wasn't difficult to take off, land, or complete the mission with the aircraft.
Major An added that successfully completing the first test flight is not the end, but only the beginning. For the next 4 years, more prototypes of the KF-21 will be put through around 2,200 more test flights. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
It's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. South Korea has been seeing an uptick in COVID-19 cases recently, with the number hovering above 70,000 per day. The Central Disaster Countermeasures Headquarters say that at this wave's peak, that the number will be 300,000 daily.
And with infections doubling week to week, health officials have implemented some additional virus prevention measures. But where does the country need to go now in terms of taming the spread of the virus? For more, we have Professor Kim Moon-gyu of Yonsei University with us today. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, good. First, the government decided to bring back some COVID-19 prevention measures for people at vulnerable facilities on Wednesday. Was this enough, or does more need to be done?
Well, currently the Omicron infection is spreading right now, and I think BA.5 is the major subvariant in Korea right now. And in my experience, BA.5 is picking up persons who are not infected before. And well, Korea has a high rate of vaccination, and this vaccination actually cannot prevent infection, but it has an advantage to prevent severe infections. So my point of view is we have to be more focused on severe cases. I mean, if there's a person who have underlying conditions, if his age is more than 65, that means this person might get severely infected and might have to admit to intensive care unit. So I think even though the government has some policies, everybody has to be vigilant and do their job and take care of people who have underlying conditions and elderly.
And Professor, well, on Wednesday, the country reported the highest number of imported infections to date at 429. And, well, previously there were some measures in place like a quarantine period or limited entry, which of course drew a lot of complaints. Do you think these kind of measures are going to be introduced again?
Well, I hope not. I do want to emphasize that we cannot rely on rapid antigen test kits because it doesn't have any meaning if it have a negative result. We have to keep on testing people if needed by a PCR test. And as we know, there were many variants emerging from some countries such as India or Africa. So if a person is coming from that area, we need a special concern for them. And this will not prevent totally unexported cases, but it will slow down. So slowing down has its own meaning, so we can have time to study about the new variant and be prepared for that kind of outbreak. So I do believe we need to do the job as we did in the airports or seaports.
Now, we want to talk more on the medical infrastructure of the country. Omicron subvariant BA.5 is in the country and spreading fast, and it's also known to be more transmissible. Health authorities say the country's medical infrastructure still has capacity, but do you think when do you think is the point when the country may feel the pressure?
Well, we are not at the point of the situation of March or April now, but as I work in an emergency department, I feel the pressure every time with COVID cases. If I have to admit a patient to an intensive care unit, it is difficult to find a bed for them, and especially when the patient has some comorbidity, some underlying conditions, it becomes more difficult. There are hospitals with enough manpower and facilities, but in general, Korea is still not enough for the needs. And I think Korea needs to upgrade the capacity to take care of severe cases in the whole country.
And really, it's the critically ill cases, the patients that we need to be worried about. And as for the daily tally, we've seen it rise before to the hundreds of thousands. And really, this time around, how worried do you think we should be about the soaring level of infections that we're seeing day to day these days?
Well, the numbers sometimes makes us tired, but at least it keeps us vigilant for these situations and what is happening around us. There are many meanings behind the number. There are hidden meanings, and we cannot have the accurate data if we continue to rely on rapid antigen test kits. I think that if you have a high chance to get infected, I recommend to go for a PCR test. And as I previously mentioned, the total number is not that important right now. I think we have to focus on severe cases, people with high age or underlying conditions, and those people might have to go through intensive care, so the numbers of the ICU beds are important. And also, I'm very interested that how much people are reinfected by Omicron. So I'm waiting for our health authorities to give out those precise numbers, and also I'm waiting for the antibody positive rates, because a few months ago we have a high rate of antibody positive rate, about 95, but it was only a small scale study. So I do wish to have the new data from larger scale of study.
Right, and hopefully because so many of us, of South Koreans are vaccinated, not that many are sent to ICUs with COVID-19 infection, like you said. Well, thank you for joining us this morning, and we hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up the first half of New Day at Arirang, but stay with us because coming up in the second half,
we cover political and the economic situation in Sri Lanka as lawmakers in the nation choose a deeply unpopular president. So how are the citizens reacting and what does the future hold for the country? Find out more in the second half, so don't go away. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean new Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
Protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Forever.
welcome back to New Day at Arirang. Alarm bells are ringing as climate change makes its presence in Europe continues with raging wildfires due to soaring temperatures.
And this comes as the United States is also grappling with a deadly heat wave with over 100 million people put under heat warnings across the country. Kim Yo-sun with more.
As Europe grappled with its own deadly heat wave in the U.S. dangerously high temperatures that have baked south-central areas of the country are becoming more widespread. Some 100 million people from New York City to Las Vegas are seeing heat warnings this week as the mercury rises well above 38 degrees Celsius. Authorities say temperatures could increase further and continue throughout the weekend. The heat wave comes as President Joe Biden said Wednesday that his administration remains committed to tackling climate change.
And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger. The health of our citizens and our communities is literally at stake.
While he stopped short of declaring an emergency, he did announce a package of executive actions and promised more aggressive measures going forward. Across the Atlantic in Europe, forest fires continue to rage across the region as an unprecedented heat wave has led to soaring temperatures. Firefighters struggle to contain wildfires that are raging out of control across southern Europe on Wednesday. This comes as the UK experienced its hottest day in history at 40.3 degrees. While the record heat last week around parts of the Mediterranean has now eased, readings have begun heading up again in Portugal, Spain, and Italy. In Portugal, over 10,000 hectares of land have been burned since Sunday, and around 800 firefighters have been deployed to tackle fires. Several wildfires also broke out in Italy, with one even leading to a gas tank explosion, prompting hundreds of nearby residents to flee the area. Many are now concerned about the future.
Our grandchildren, my grandchildren and other people's, the youth will suffer a lot if this doesn't stop.
Scorching temperatures are also putting at risk the area's vulnerable population. So far, over 1,900 heat-related deaths have been reported in Spain and Portugal. Local authorities and climate scientists warn that climate change is behind the deadly wildfires, with hotter weather sapping moisture from vegetation, turning it into dry fuel that helps fires to spread. 김혜선, Arirang News.
Sri Lankan members of parliament on Wednesday voted acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe to become the new president amid a crippling economic and political crisis in the country. Voting in the 225-member parliament resulted in 134 votes for Wickremesinghe and 82 for rival Dulas Alahaparuma. The former Prime Minister takes over the top office after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country last week, and pundits say despite the new president being in place, further protests could be on the horizon as Wickremesinghe was a close ally of the former president. He will serve out the rest of the presidential term until November 2024.
Ever since President Yoon took office and moved into his new office in Yongsan-gu District, South Korea's former presidential office and residence, Cheongwadae, or the Blue House, has been open to public, and now with the gates staying open into the night. Starting Wednesday, the nation's new popular landmark is offering guided evening tours. Those lucky enough to book a spot will get to see Cheongwadae in a whole new light. Lee Si-woo takes us there.
The gates open and an imposing sight appears. It is Cheongwadae, or the Blue House, opening to the public for the first time in the evening. Hosted by South Korea's Cultural Heritage Administration, the special nighttime tour provides a different view of the Blue House. Across from what's called the Grand Garden sits the symbolic main building.
Here behind me, you can see the iconic blue tiles that make up the roof of Bongwan, or the main office hall where the presidents of South Korea carried out their day-to-day office work.
The tour takes the group around the Blue House, starting at the main office hall. Guests can enter the building where they can view paintings handpicked by former presidents. Up the stairs is a large painting of the Korean peninsula depicting the country's natural landscape. The highlight of the main office hall is, of course, the large open presidential office. Also in the building is the room of the First Lady, called the Room of the Rose of Sharon. Leaving the main office hall, the visitors are led to the Gwanja, or presidential residence, where a performance by a gayagum and cello duet awaits them. The building is where the presidents and their families resided. The next stop is the Sangchunjae Reception House, which boasts a traditional style of architecture. Sangchunjae is where informal talks and tea were held with guests from outside the Blue House. It is where former President Moon Jae-in spoke with former U.S. President Donald Trump. Next, along the trail surrounding Nokjiwon, a large garden boasting around 120 species of plants, are colorful lasers that light up the trees and bushes. After a mesmerizing sight in the garden only offered in the evening, visitors are led back to near the entrance by the main office hall and dark backdrop of Bugaksan Mountain. Visitors say that the tour is a mesmerizing experience.
It's just very touching to be able to see the history of such a country like Korea. And it's very beautiful to be able to see not only the background, but also see how we're integrating and how everything is changing through the years.
The 12-day event began on Wednesday. Over 55,000 people entered the entrance raffle in late June and early July, but with just 2 90-minute tours a day and each tour allowing 50 people, only 1,200 people will have the chance to enjoy an evening stroll around the Blue House through this special program. Lee Si-woo, Arirang News.
It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. After months of public anger and protests against the ruling elite amid worsening fuel, food and medicine shortages, as well as the flight of the sitting president, Sri Lanka's members of parliament have picked the acting president, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, as the official replacement. Having won the majority of the presidential vote cast by MPs on Wednesday, Wickremesinghe will finish his predecessor's term and take on the various economic and political crises crippling the country. But the six-time PM is deeply unpopular unpopular with the public, who see him as being part or even the cause of the problems that they're faced with. So why did lawmakers elect the controversial figure, and what lies ahead for the crisis-struck country? Well, we discussed this today with Arirang, Senior Assistant Editor at Himar South Asian, and Jo Jung-jae, Senior Research Fellow of the Center for Area Studies at Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us this morning in Seoul. And first of all, my first question to you, Mr. Arirang. Now, the Prime Minister, he was voted yesterday to replace the President, and Mr. Wickremesinghe, though, he was blamed for really worsening the debt and energy crises, not really acting to resolve it properly, but now he's been elected as president by members of the parliament. So how are members of the public really reacting to this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it's difficult to gauge the public sentiment at large right now. But if you have to go by the protest groups at the main protest site in Colombo, I mean, yesterday there was a silent protest against the appointment. And the day before, they burnt an effigy of Ranil Wickremesinghe. And the rallying cry has been quite consistent for the last 6 months. Protesters and the public have been loud and clear about their demands that both Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickremesinghe should resign. So protest groups have declared, as you also mentioned, that the protests will continue. In the general public, sentiment is very difficult to gauge right now, but the protest groups have declared that they will continue.
And well, what is the reason, Mr. Arirang, that members of the parliament picked this figure? I mean, given just how deeply unpopular he is.
Well, the reason for this is, I think he held the majority. So the governing party, which were previously under the Rajapaksas, were held by Ranil Wickremesinghe. So, I mean, simply it's a numbers game. So, because he held the majority, he is now the president.
And now, Professor Jo Jung-jae, now, what is your reaction to Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's rather controversial victory?
Yeah, to sum up my thought from beginning, is very anxiety. The Ranil Wickremesinghe, the new president, emphasized differentiations from the previous government. But the question is whether the public perceived that way. When the important political leaderships, such as President, Prime Minister, and the Finance Minister are stable, the bailout negotiations with IMF, which is the most urgent and the hope of escaping from the economic crisis, can be quickly pursued. Currently, there are no politicians or the political forces with a strong public support. If Sri Lanka goes to early president elections or general elections, it will take more time, but we cannot be optimistic about the outcome. Such an unstable political leadership appears as a delay in the negotiations with the IMF, which in turn prolongs the suffering period of the people and may continue a vicious cycle in which the public's distrust of the political leadership rises again.
And of course, Dr. Cho, now a national crisis rarely stays within its borders these days, and a lot of Sri Lanka's Asian neighbours are watching very closely. And what does Sri Lanka's situation mean for the regional and international community?
Yeah, the trigger of the economic crisis was a failure in the foreign exchange management. But in fact, the reason Sri Lanka has been pushed to the brink is the surge in international energy prices following the Russia invasion of Ukraine. After the 30 years civil war ended in 2009, almost all the policies such as export and strategic industry promotions, large-scale infrastructure developments, and financial and foreign exchange management were not properly implemented. in a situation where the fundamental was very weak due to the effect of the Easter bomb terror in 2019 and COVID-19 in 2020. Sri Lanka was hit by the shock of the global inflations caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. In other words, Sri Lanka has mismanaged its economy and had very bad luck. In this regard, I believe that the international community, which made unavoidable stray bully to Sri Lanka, should be criticized as well.
Well, it would be fair to say that it was the former ruling elite that caused the problems, and it's the Sri Lankan citizens who are now having to deal with the consequences. Mr. Arirang, now, what is the situation over there? How are people really living day to day due to the consequence of months and months of inaction by politicians?
Yeah, I mean, although we have had all these protests, the crisis still continues. There are daily power cuts, and there is severe fuel shortages, along with medical shortages and shortages of medical equipment. But it's the fuel shortages, I think, it's really hitting the Sri Lankans very hard. Because I mean, as you might see along the near the fuel sheds, there are huge lines, and now for the last week we haven't had. We basically haven't had fuel. The general public have not been able to access fuel, and I think yesterday there was a fuel shipment which arrived. And the Minister of Energy has come up with a plan to distribute fuel evenly. But the inflation is skyrocketing for the last few months, and day to day, like wage earners are suffering immensely. So yeah, it's we are very much still in crisis.
And the question is, Mr. Arirang, the Prime Minister, who is now going to be the official president, he had months and months to deal with this, and while most people think he didn't deal with it at all, and safeguarding people's livelihoods and getting Sri Lanka out of this multifaceted crisis, is it going to be possible for him to do that? Do people have confidence that the new president is going to take very decisive steps to do this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Now, he has had over 2 months since he was appointed PM to alleviate this condition. But of course, I think people also understand that these are deep-seated issues. This economic crisis is stemming from, as my fellow analyst said, is stemming from gross mismanagement and misguided policies by this government. And also, we could also attribute some of the responsibility to the COVID pandemic and the economic recession that that resulted from that. But the president, he has a huge task ahead of him. That is to get the country back on track, get the country's economy back on track, and also to conclude the IMF negotiations. And also, since the parliament itself is quite fractured, getting them to work towards a common goal would be another great challenge that he would face. So whether he's able to do that, now along with that, he needs to also appease the people, appease these protest groups who have not accepted his appointment. So it's going to be very difficult for the president in the coming few months. We will just have to see how he will deal with it.
Well, Dr. Cho, now, Sri Lanka's economic growth rate is expected to decrease by more than 6% this year, according to the governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And, well, what does this mean for foreign companies, including South Korean firms, which are some of the biggest investors in the Southeast Asian nation?
Yeah. Currently, it's known that there are about 60 Korean companies and about 600 Koreans in Sri Lanka. as we saw in the media, considering the long lines to buy fuel for automobiles and the longer the outage time rather than the power supply time, it must be very difficult situations for local Korean companies as well as Korean companies. In particular, the economic damages to the self-employed would be greater. Development cooperation's project through the ODAs are also not being promoted properly. However, since the scale of the trade and investment between Korea and Sri Lanka has not lost relatively, the impact on Korean economy is not increasing. Also, it is fortunate that no direct damage to our residents has been reported yet, but they seems in a very anxious time. So hopefully Sri Lanka will get out of the economic crisis as soon as possible.
And Dr. Cho, what kind of strategy or action is needed by South Korea to really respond to this economic crisis in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, our economy is totally different with the situation of the Sri Lanka, especially the economic fundamental is very strong. However, unfavorable environment is gradually being developed for our economy, which is highly dependent on the foreign trade. The global economic growth rate is significantly lower than initially expected, and global inflation pressures are rising, leading to a phase of the stagflations. It is necessary to prepare more actively for economic management, keeping in mind that the second and the third Sri Lanka can continue to emerge. We should continue to check the supply chains related to the individual countries.
Of course, neighbouring countries in the region do need to prepare to respond to this as well. But Mr. Wickremesinghe, now, what can other countries do to help safeguard the livelihoods of everyday Sri Lankan citizens?
Well, that is a difficult question. I guess our neighboring countries, so for example, taking India and China, they've been helping with credit lines, with a lot of aid. But at this point, I think we need to get our tourism industry back on track. And I think because that will bring in much needed foreign exchange, because one of the main issues that we have is that we have no foreign exchange for these essential imports that we need to run the country. So getting tourism back on track would be one of the ways that other countries can help us. And of course, buying our exports. But we don't have a burgeoning export industry. So these are some of the ways that other countries can help Sri Lanka.
And lastly, Mr. Wickremesinghe, now throughout this crisis, the protests that mostly began in April, we were able to see different ethnic groups really come together and call for change. So what do you hope to see in the future of Sri Lanka's democracy?
Yeah, I think this narrative has been widely circulated, that the protests, for the protests, Sri Lankans are coming together despite their differences for one collective common cause. I was at most of these protests, and yes, it's encouraging to see that. But as a country with a long history of communal violence and nationalistic policies that hurt communal harmony, we have to take these calls of unity with a pinch of salt. The protests themselves are not equal. How protesters are treated in Colombo and how they're treated by the armed forces in other parts of the country, like the north and east, are vastly different. But there is a sense of awareness of this difference by the people in the south, which I think is a very good first step. So I think there is something to be optimistic about in the fact that Sri Lankans from all segments of life came together in this one common goal to say no to the government that they were that were taking all these misguided and misguided decisions, and so they kind of took power to their own hands, which is, I think, is again another encouraging sign.
That was Marlon Arirang, Senior Assistant Editor at Himal South Asian, and Cho Chung-jae, Senior Research Fellow of the Centre for Area Studies at Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you guys.
Let's start in the UK as a race to elect a new Prime Minister has come to the final two candidates.
Well, that's right, Do-yeon. So former Chancellor Rishi Sunak and Foreign Secretary Liz Truss are facing off to become the UK's next leader. Now, the finalists were decided on Wednesday following a series of votes by Conservative MPs. Sunak had the most support among MPs with 137 votes, and Truss took 113 votes, narrowly beating former Defence Secretary Penny Mordaunt. The final two candidates will now try to win the votes of roughly 160,000 Conservative Party members, with the winner announced on September 5th. Meanwhile, sitting Prime Minister Boris Johnson held his final Prime Minister's questions on the same day. During the session, Johnson took aim at the Treasury for not supporting big spending projects and said that Twitter should not be taken seriously. He signed off by declaring that his mission was largely accomplished for now. Italy's government looks set to collapse as three main members of Prime Minister Mario Draghi's coalition refused to participate in a confidence vote. The vote was called by the PM in a bid to renew the alliance. However, the vote was boycotted by the hard-right League and centre-right Forza Italia parties, as well as the populist Five Star Movement, which had initially triggered the political crisis. Despite Draghi winning the confidence vote in Italy's upper house on Wednesday by 95 to 38 votes, the PM looks likely to resign after 18 months in office. The U.S. House of Representatives has voted to pass a bill that could guarantee federal law protections for same-sex marriage. The Democrat-led House voted 267 to 157, with 47 Republicans in favor. The bill, called the Respect for Marriage Act, now needs to pass the U.S. Senate, where at least 10 Republicans would need to join with Democrat senators to overcome the 60-vote filibuster threshold. If signed into law, same-sex marriage would be protected nationwide, and federal protections for interracial marriages would also be provided. This comes amid fears that the Supreme Court's conservative majority could move against same-sex marriage, following its overturning of Roe v. Wade. Quidditch, a sport from the fictional world of Harry Potter and recreated in real-life tournaments, is undergoing a name change. According to the sport's governing bodies, on Wednesday, the real-life version will be called Quadball. The move is to try to avoid any trademark issues with Warner Brothers. It is also to distance the sport from Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling's views on transgender issues. Both U.S. Quidditch and Major League Quidditch have rebranded to U.S. Quadball and Major League Quadball and will be joined by the International Quidditch Association. The sport sees two teams of 7 players run around with broomsticks between their legs, trying to score points. According to the IQA, almost 600 teams across 40 countries play the sport.
Good morning. Rain that started late last night continues through this morning. Rain will let up from the west as the day goes on, but east of Gangwon-do province could see rain through tomorrow at dawn. So 20 to 60 millimeters of rain is in the forecast there, while the rest of the country could see 5 to 40 millimeters. Skies will see plenty of cloud cover with high humidity, which could make things more uncomfortable despite some temperatures drops. Now, the capital region has some pleasant overnight conditions, but parts of Jeju Island are waking up to a sweltering morning temperatures at about 30 degrees Celsius already. And highs will be 2 to 5 degrees lower than Wednesday across Korea, hovering around 30 degrees Celsius for many. But the humidity will make it feel muggier, while strong winds are expected in parts of Jeju Island with a strong wind advisory being in place. Now, passing rain is in the forecast on Friday, then nationwide monsoon rain is in the forecast this weekend. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
That wraps up our newscast for this hour, but we will be back tomorrow for our Friday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thanks for joining us this morning, and do tune into Arirang News for updates throughout the day. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Take care.
Thank you.